Today, I am so happy to have with us our co-president of InterPride, Natalie Thompson. Natalie is also the vice president of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility at Capital Pride Alliance. And we're so happy to have you here today, Natalie.
I'm really excited to be here and be in conversation with you, and really excited to talk about um, the Pride movement and what it means to be, a person of color, but even beyond that, being Black in this space, because anti-Blackness is still very much a thing within all of our communities, and having networks that are really geared towards conversations around how we, as part of like the African diaspora, are really represented within Pride spaces is important.
Exactly, Natalie. I think it's a conversation that we need to have, and we need to have more of these kinds of conversation because there are some issues that we need to address. There is, like a atmosphere that's coming over us where people are uncomfortable talking about these things. We have political leaders who are saying that, hey, we don't need to talk about CRT. We don't need to talk about implicit bias. We don't need to discuss DEI because they're uncomfortable with it. And also, it's going to reveal some truths, right? And so they don't want to have the conversation, but I think it's important that we have these conversations. So I wanted to get started. Just have a few questions for you. Um, what are the challenges and the joys that you face as an African American female co-president, as well as a vice president with Capital Pride Alliance?
Yeah, so I am really proud to be a leader within Pride spaces, my work within InterPride, my work within Capital Pride in Washington, D.C. But it does come with challenges. And I think leadership just comes with challenges in general. And I think when we tackle on sort of stereotypes and we tackle on sort of these misaligned views of what diversity is and misaligned views of who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to act and how we're supposed to engage in these spaces, I think identity gets lost. And so you're trapped within a space of sometimes feeling like an outlier within a space that's supposed to be affirming and it's supposed to be uplifting and a space that's safe for you. I say safe, knowing that safe spaces don't really exist 100%, but like a space to be courageous and a space to sort of be more aligned with your own views. And I think as we talk about it, and within the context of conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, what gets lost is leadership of color or leadership from marginalized, underrepresented, or underserved communities. And the amount of responsibility placed on these individuals to have to hold these organizations up without sometimes the recognition of what it takes for that person to do that as they're combating some of the isms that exist within our world. And so as we talk about, sexism, so being a woman, there's absolutely sexism that exists. We talk about being a person of color, there's also racism and anti-Blackness, which is, a step further. When we talk about racism, we also have to talk about this conversation of, being a part of the queer community and being in community with folks who are marginalized and not understanding that their marginalization is not the same as my marginalization, but understanding that we are all sort of victims of this white supremacist system that is not like regionally specific, that it exists across the entire globe. And it may exist in different ways, but we're also combated with, can we have conversations around race and people's comfortability about talking about it? Or when we do, being dismissed as, that's not my experience, I don't understand that, I've never seen it, give me concrete examples. And so we find ourselves having to justify our humanity or justify why respect is not always given when it needs to be given, and why we somehow have to assimilate and code switch in order to be seen as a respectable leader. And so I want to step into spaces where I can be a leader so that folks can see there is representation, but also to make sure that it's not the representation or the visibility that truly is the end game. It's the shifting of practices, and it's the shifting of ways of engagement that is going to make it so other folks feel like they're able to come to the table, and they're able to be respected and valued for their views, and they're able to be respected and valued for their identities, and to not have to assimilate to a system that was not set up for them in the beginning.
Absolutely. We have conversations of microaggressions, and I think people forget that microaggressions are daily indignities that people of color have to endure. And so that can shape your behavior. It can shape the way you respond when you feel like you're being attacked. And those things are not taken in consideration. So I think those are some of the things that Pride organizations need to address. So we know that there are Black and Brown prides that feel that organizations like InterPride, like other international pride organizations, are not interested in discussing the challenges that their communities encounter. How would you address those concerns?
So I think as we talk about addressing the concerns, we should talk about the need for all of these affinity spaces. So even if folks felt like InterPride was a space for them, I think these affinity spaces are still important, because conversations that happen in those spaces may not and probably would not happen in those other spaces, because you have a combination of different views. And so like that courageous space that we want to create just wouldn't be there. And there are some conversations that me as a person, I only want to have with other Black folks, because I want to celebrate and commiserate in a space where I know that maybe you have not had my experience, but I know you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to switch. But going into like these international spaces, or just Pride in general, we talk about the introduction of Pride as being a protest that was started by folks of color, and like trans folks of color. And so we talk about this radical movement, and then we talk about how it's sort of been shifted. And some folks think that it's been bastardized from sort of its iteration. And I look at it as we've lost some things, absolutely, but everything needs to evolve. But we've evolved in a space that we didn't bring everyone along. Like everyone was not brought into it. So we see a lot of prides that are maybe more male-centric or maybe more homogenous. And when I say homogenous, I'm just going to name it that many folks look at Pride as a white space. And white people aren't going to change that for us, right? We can create our own spaces, and I think we should create our own spaces. And those spaces are also not off limits to us. So as we talk about sort of these like larger prides or even smaller prides around the world, they are for everyone. They are spaces for us all to be able to convene. And if those spaces are not having the conversations that we think they should be having, then what is the responsibility for that group? And then what is the responsibility for us as folks who are like, I am dedicated and I want this, I'm yearning for this space. When it comes to conversations of interested or not interested, it really deals with who is leading the charge. And then who is also at the table, who are part of these leadership organizations, or part of these organizations who are the leaders within these spaces. If they're not willing to step into those conversations, it is up to us to remove them from those spaces. And when I say remove them, like let's talk about a membership organization. You as a member have the ability to vote for leadership that represents you and represents your values. Be smart about how you vote. When it comes to other groups that, it's more board led in terms of, the votes happen internally, reach out, talk to someone. What does it take to get on that board? What does it take to be a part of the other leadership structures? And have those conversations. And I'm all for folks being able to write to these organizations to say, I want to engage, and this is what I'm not seeing. How can we work together to shift that? Because I'm invested, I'm engaged. there has to be an investment, I think, from all parties to make that work. And I think what I'm experiencing, being in these spaces is more of a demand, like a demand to change. And I think demands are fine in and of themselves, but if I'm demanding this other person to do what I want when I say that I want, and I'm not willing to do anything to step in to support that space, nothing's really going to happen, because whatever they create is without your voice. Whatever they do is without someone who can educate and encourage and inspire and to move that needle forward. And so there's an opportunity, and for those who are willing to take it, to step into the uncomfortable. And it may not be for everybody, but there are some of us who are trying to do that. And then what I would also say is, for us folks of color who are in leadership positions in these, I would say, historically, traditionally, homogeneously white spaces, we are doing the best we absolutely can with this system that hasn't necessarily seen that this was a problem. And so when you have an expectation that something is going to miraculously or immediately change, like, bump that. That's not, like, it took years for this progression to happen. It's going to take years for us to evolve and transform into something different. Allow that space, allow that time, step up to support them, if maybe not to support the organization as a whole, but us leaders of color need support. And I feel like sometimes we are shunned. We're not supported on either end, but we still try to be in this space to make it work. And we do what we can with the time that we're given, and to make it better than how we found it, so the next leader can step in and continue that progress. But we see this all the time. This happens with leaders of color within any spaces, even outside of the Pride space. The challenge is the same, and the conversations need to be the same. But I want us as people to find our community, create plans of action, and work with each other to support that progression, so that we have space everywhere, that we can create our own spaces, and we can transform existing spaces, and so that people are not having to feel that they are isolated from these opportunities.
No, you're absolutely right. It's oftentimes when we're people of color and we're in leadership roles, then there's this demand to fix whatever the problem is. But like you said, we're working with a great deal of lack of support, rather, from either side. Hey, you guys fix it, and I'll be involved, but I'm not willing to do anything to help you to fix it. And then oftentimes we feel like we're bumping our head against the wall, particularly at a more white-dominated organization. And like you said, whether it's part of Pride or not, we're still in the same situation. So, yeah, we're happy to do the work, but we need the support, and that's sorely lacking.
And I want to be clear that when I talk about sort of getting it from all sides, I'm really talking about you're talking about community that's like clamoring and asking for change. And then you're talking about organizational structures that need to change. And you're talking about making sure that folks have a foundation for, like, the foundational knowledge to know these are the structures and these are the things, and this is how this is a barrier. Like, understanding that there has to be internal and external work that's done in order to get there. So it's not a condemnation on people in general. It's just change takes a lot of interpersonal and community engagement in order to make those things level out. And so when I talk about flack on both sides, I get it. I'm asking you to evolve. I'm asking you to hold on, wanting to get to a common ground. And that common ground may not always look like what you want. And the thought is, are we in a better position? It's not settling, but it's moving the needle. We don't live in, I don't know that we could survive in a space where it's always burn it down and start over.
Right. Exactly. So Natalie, rainbow racism is a thing. And when I talk about rainbow racism, I'm referring to racism that takes place within queer spaces, within queer communities, within queer organizations. So we live in an atmosphere where those who are empowered would like to pretend that these issues don't exist because it makes them uncomfortable. You've addressed this a little bit, but can we get a little bit more detail about your thoughts on countering this?
Yeah, I say to folks who are uncomfortable, well, boo, get uncomfortable. Like, we live in uncomfortable spaces all the time. Like, the world is uncomfortable. Um, and if talking about the existence of racism makes you uncomfortable, I would ask you to ask yourself, where's that uncomfortable feeling coming from? Is it uncomfortable because you wish that we didn't live in a world that was like this and you're uncomfortable the fact that people experience this? Or are you uncomfortable because you don't want someone to point the finger that they may be looking at you as you're being a racist? Um, if it's the latter, then you got some work to do, boo. Um, what I will say to everyone, and I don't care if you are a person of color or a non-person of color, I'm saying this to everyone. We have all been indoctrinated into a system of white supremacy. Like, that is always going to be a thing. And my dog just got home from his walk, so you're going to hear him in the background. All right, I'm going to start over just a little bit. We've all been indoctrinated into a system of white supremacy. And there are many things that us as people of color need to unlearn, like feeling those, or experiencing sort of that want to shift, to assimilate to a more digestible, personality, or you want to aesthetically change yourself because you don't want to be too radical in certain spaces. And so I think for all of us, we have to be uncomfortable we have to get comfortable within the uncomfortable to talk about how we have been impacted by racism and by sexism and by transphobia and by, if we have a religious upbringing, like what those things have done to shape who we are. And if that doesn't align with what we want to see in the world, then you've got to do the hard work to break that down for you. We talk about rainbow racism. I brought it up earlier that, we are all part in this queer community of, this marginalized identity. And so sometimes folks take that on as, I can't be racist, or I have Black friends, or I'm queer, and what about my rights? And all of that is fine and dandy. Like, you can think about what about my rights, because it's about human rights, right? We're not free. Like, none of us are free until we're all free. Like, that's a true statement. Because if they're attacking you, they're going to come after me next. Like, that's just how the cycle of oppression works. So when we talk about rainbow racism, you have to step outside of this one marginalization that you may have. You have to understand where you are privileged and where you don't have privilege. You have to understand what your power is in some situations and what power you don't have in some situations. Like, I'll give you an example. At work, I am a director. There is power in that. There's a hierarchy in that. And I have to recognize that in this space, I am now engaging with folks who do not have the same level of authority that I have within this space. So I understand I have privilege in that. We shift the conversation though, and I support many cisgendered, like straight white folks who have a considerable amount of power when they walk out of their house in the real world. And so understanding the dichotomy of, in certain spaces we do have power, and it's important for us to use that power responsibly, and then also understand in certain spaces we are not privileged. We do not have a level of authority. We do not have power, and understanding that. And I think when people can get really clear on, when we talk about white privilege and we talk about male privilege, those things actually exist. Those things are not made up. Those things are based off of a system that is centuries old that we have got to break down. And when you're not able to see that, okay, I might be queer, but I'm also male, there's considerable power in that. And then if you're talking about, I might be queer, but I am male and I am affluent. and I make a lot of money. There's another level of considerable power there. And your experience as a human who navigates in this world, you may not have ever experienced any of the things that Black folks have ever talked about. And you might say, well, I'm also queer and I also have to deal with discrimination and somebody used the F word, or, I wasn't able to get married, and say all of these things, which are legitimate. I want to be very clear. Those are legitimate concerns and they should be addressed. But do not equate that in the same way as being a Black person out in the street. It is not the same. And that's when we talk about rainbow racism. Until we understand privilege and power, until we understand how this exists in not this microcosm of our queer community, but this exists globally, we will never be able to break down those barriers. I honestly believe that people are uncomfortable because they don't want to be seen as the enemy. But that keeps them from actually doing the work. When they don't want to have the conversation, they're not actually doing the work, which means they are in turn a part of the problem. And people don't like to hear that, but you are in turn a part of the problem. In some small instance, I'm not saying that you have to put on a Klan rally hat and walk around with a tiki torch, but you are uplifting this system by your engagement or non-engagement in these types of conversations and knowledge sharing, learning, and transformation. And that's very hard for people. And I also think it's hard for us people of color to sometimes give people a little bit of grace around we're asking them to do some really heavy work. It's a requirement, and I want to make sure everyone knows, I do think it's a requirement. You don't get out of it because it's heavy. You don't get out of it because it's hard. And that us not allowing some space for growth and mistake and for communication does not serve any of us. It's not our responsibility to educate and forgive and all this other stuff, but it is part of our responsibility to allow the growth to happen.
So, Natalie, we know that there is a very overt kind of racism, but unfortunately, people seem to think that unless someone is carrying a swastika or, or wearing the hoods from the Klan, that it's not really racism. They forget about the microaggressions, the more subversive kind of racism that people of color deal with on a daily basis. So you mentioned Klan rally hat. That's going to piss some people off. Can you clarify what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think of course it's going to piss people off because, the conversations that we hear a lot are, and I think especially from white folks who are sort of combating this conversation around racism and combating these conversations around what's happening in the world, and everything is about race. When I say that, I really want to make sure that folks are clear that being part of the Klan is not the only way to be a racist. Displaying a swastika is not the only way that racism is displayed. These are just really overt ways that we've seen, or the Confederate flag. These are just overt ways. But what we're talking about, and we're not saying that people are racist, just a general term. What we're saying is that these supremacist views have been so ingrained in our day in and day out lives. They've been ingrained in our policies. They've been ingrained in our governments, that we only see these overt things as being once those change, everything should be fine. People refer back to the civil rights movement in the United States as, well, there was a civil rights movement. You had Dr. King. Look at that. Everything's fixed now, right? Why can't people just get it together? And then folks forget that redlining's a thing. People forget that redistricting a thing. So when you have large communities of color and they're ooh, we need to shift this so that we can get the politicians in the space that we want who are aligned with our views. And so this is what I mean, that it is not necessarily these old school views of racism that we need to be focused on. all the time. Like, we know who they are. We know that they are very overt with their stuff. But for those folks who are like, I want to do better, or I don't know what you're talking about, actually take the time to hear it, actually take the time to learn, actually understand how ingrained these things are into our society, so that we stop looking at these overt views of racism as the only way that it's displayed, and that we start looking at the ways in which we communicate with each other. I remember in college, it was my first week of college, and I was hanging out with these women who were in my dorm, and they all happened to be like majority Asian. And I remember one of them was like, "Oh, you're so pretty," and I thought she was going to stop there. And I was like, "Hey," and then she's like, "For a black girl," and I was like, "Well, I don't know where we go from here. I don't know what we do with this." And it was just sort of those things where someone thought that they were being kind. Someone thought that they were giving a compliment, and someone was like, I have to separate you from your blackness really quickly for me to like feel comfortable. So this is what I mean, that it's not always overt. It's not always like a white pointy hat or a swastika or a tiki torch now, apparently, is this new thing. But it's conversations like that where anti-blackness is very clear in that conversation, and they don't know. Like, they don't know that it exists there. And it's hard, like, for us, for many of us, to really sit in those spaces and be like, what do I do here? I'm now extremely uncomfortable. And why am I the one uncomfortable? I didn't do anything wrong, but I now have to deal with this person's ignorance in this space, and like shift who I'm being in this space to like deal with my feelings about this situation. And then do I have to also deal with this person? It's a lot to take on, and it's not fair. And this is the type of work that I want people to do. And so, just to clarify, I'm not saying that all white people are racist. I'm not saying that, you know, you might as well go put on a Klan hat. I'm not saying any of those things. What I'm saying is we have to be smarter about how we see racism. We have to educate ourselves and be knowledgeable and understand that it exists in a number of different places. And then we also have to understand that we have lived in these systems our entire life. So as Black folks, there is work for us to do. We have got to dismantle the ways in which it has shaped us to think against our own self-interest. Like, that's work that we can do.
Absolutely. And for those who still need a little bit more clarity, you know, let's be clear. Let me give you the example saying that, hey, I don't see race. I'm colorblind. That is a microaggression. That is a bias. That is a branch of racism. So even though you're not walking around with the neo-Nazi sign on your hand, making that statement contributes, perpetuates the racism that we're talking about. So yeah, there is a difference, but it's still fruit from the same tree at the same
Right?
time.
Right? Oh, I heard this quote the other day. I was watching this TV show, and it was about policing. And one of the women was a Black police officer, and she went to a community meeting, and it was Black women really talking about how they can shape their community, and they didn't know that she was a police officer. They found out midway through the meeting, and she's like, but I'm one of the good ones, and I'm trying my best. And I really believe that there are people who wear the uniform who are trying their best. But the woman who was leading and facilitating the meeting, she said, you know, you are on a rotten tree, so you can't tell me that some of the rot hasn't, you know, rubbed off on you. Like, your core is rotten. And so when I think about that, I think about like what you just said. Like, the core is rotten, and so all of these little branches, you know, it's a little bit less rot, but it still exists. How do we cut that out? How do we shift that? How do we transform that? And that means we transform systems. That means we don't fight each other when it comes to you should do this, you should do that. It means we work together to say, it's not perfect. What is our ultimate goal? What are the steps we can take to get there? And how do we uplift each other within that space and be, as opposed to tear each other down? I feel like recently, and I've been very stuck with this and very moved by this, that community feels very different now because I think we have forgotten how to communicate, to understand, and to move forward. I feel we sit in a space where it's one way or another, and there's little room for nuanced conversation. There's little room for the educational portion of the conversation. There's little room for disagreement without chastising or belittling or condemning. And I'd like to create spaces or be in spaces where conversations can happen and folks can be on all sides of the spectrum, but the ultimate goal is to really communicate and really look at stuff's not working. How do we get here? How do we get to the place where we want to be? And I think it takes a lot of emotional intelligence from a lot of people to make that happen. And I feel like emotional intelligence is not a skill that we are valuing anymore.
That is so true. I would encourage people and, our listeners, two things. Keith Boykin has a book out called Why is Everything About Race?
Because it is. Everything's racist. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. And so he goes through step by step of why certain things are considered racist. It's a really interesting book. I would encourage people to read that. And also, I recently gave a workshop where I talked about 12 biases in the workplace, and one of them is attribution bias. And it touches on what you were just saying, Natalie, that you can't even have a disagreement without people engaging in character assassination. I don't agree with you, so therefore you are incompetent. I don't see things the way you see them, or you don't see the way I see them, so therefore you are an idiot. We can't even just have an exchange of ideas. It goes right to, you're not a good person, and right to character assassination. Is discouraging. And that's attribution bias. I would encourage anybody who's not aware of it to please look that up, because I am seeing it on a regular basis, both within queer spaces and queer communities, as well as outside.
And I think it's okay for us to be in disagreement and to go separate ways. I feel like there's this need to prove people wrong. And I think it sort of is like crabs in a barrel situation. Let's find our community. Let's build our community. Let's fight for our community. And let's encourage folks to come along with us. And if they don't want to, we have to be okay with that. Like, it is their right to be wherever they are. And that's sometimes hard for people to really grasp. And I think that it's hard for many of us because we're like, what are you thinking? Like, you should know better. And maybe they should. But there's a level of self-preservation that's needed in order for us to continue this work. And so fighting a system as opposed to fighting a person is our best way of success.
Agreed. And then, Natalie, we are facing a debate as to whether prides are solely a celebration, or is it a human rights, are they human rights organizations? Because we talk about, as you mentioned, there were trans people of color who decided to fight back against the oppression from the police and from politicians with Stonewall. So since Pride started out as a protest, we are now at a point. Is it a human rights? Are they human rights organizations, or are they just a way to party and let our hair down? What do you think?
So this is another thing that I'm sort of constantly thinking about. Everything evolves. And so Pride has evolved and protesting has evolved. And I would say one thing you said is they decided to sort of fight against the oppression. It was a necessity. Like, to me, it was a necessity that you can't continue to thrive and live in this space cannot like rise up and fight back. Like they saw it as a necessity, not something they wanted to do. You know what I mean? Like something they needed to do and they were willing to do to create something better for themselves and for the rest of us. And so as I look at pride, pride will always be a form of protest. We are closing streets down. We are making sure that we are visible and out there. And pride looks different everywhere. But it's an opportunity for convening. And I'm a firm believer that human rights also needs to center joy. Like I think we lose sight of how important joy is and connection. And so when we talk about pride and we talk about our queer community and we talk about like human rights and celebrations, it can be all things and it could be valid to be all things. And I think it is not our place to tell anyone what their pride looks like. That if they want it to be celebration, we need that. That is a source of healing for many of us and a source of community and connection. And it is not our space to deny someone the ability to be able to do that. Just like you wouldn't want anybody to deny your space of shutting a street down and like locking yourselves together to protest something that's happening in the world. By all means, like speak up. So for me, they're all valid forms of engagement around pride. And that goes back to my previous thing, is some people are like, it should always be a protest and like these celebrations are not what it's supposed to be. And I think that's outdated to think that it can't evolve. And I think it's a disservice to say that pride can't solely be about joy and connection. And I think it's valid. Do I think all should always be like that? No. But I think there's nothing wrong with it. And if your pride is not giving you what you need, have that conversation. Tell them what you're looking for. Engage in that conversation. And if that doesn't go well, create your space, create your vision, create your mission. More is better than less. More representation, more viewpoints, more opportunities to convene. Like, let's be out here and be disruptive in any way we want to be.
Absolutely, I agree. So we shouldn't feel guilty because we're watching boys on parades in their booty shorts, that we're not doing our part for pride.
Listen, I mean, whatever you want to do, boo. Yeah, I mean, like a parade is a celebration and it's fun and it's joyous. And I think joy in and of itself is radical because many of us don't always have the opportunity to experience joy. And when we look at pride as having to be one way, we need to recognize that our way is not the only way. And I speak for myself also, like what I think pride should be is not the way that pride has to be for everyone. So let's create those spaces that exist for all of us to find our community. And yeah, like I want to see floats. I want to see people, it's their first pride and like they're overwhelmed and excited or crying with joy. Like that's a beautiful thing and it's cathartic. Let's not take that from people. And I want to rally, right? Like I want to be out there. I want to have protest signs. I want to talk about what we still can do, what we still need, how we still fight. Like boom, all of it's valid. Let's do it.
Absolutely. So Natalie, do we need prides? Have we reached a point we don't need prides anymore?
No, we absolutely need pride. But it gets to evolve, right? Going back to the conversation of evolution, we get to evolve into whatever we want it to be, and it could look any type of way, anywhere. So like what happens in, let's say, I don't know, in a small town in Georgia isn't going to be the same thing that happens in like a big city in California. Like they're all going to be different. They all should be valid. And sometimes prides are just picnics, still very valid. Like convene, 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 commune, commune, commune. Because sometimes this is the way that folks get connected to resources, they get connected to their chosen family, that they are not isolated in one spot. And as much as we'd want it to happen every day and this not to be the experience of some people, like let's not take it away from somebody that this might be their one time of year where they really truly feel seen and heard and understood and appreciated for who they authentically are.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I know you're sitting on multiple boards, so you're very busy, but I appreciate you being here, not only because you're a co-president of InterPride and vice president of Capital Pride Alliance in Washington, D.C., but because you're a friend, and I value our friendship, and I appreciate you taking the time. I wanted you to discuss one more thing before you go.
Okay.
We're having World Pride in Washington, D.C. next year. I'm so excited about that. And I know you're on the committee of the Human Rights Conference that takes place at the World Pride. Can you give us some idea of what people have to look forward to and why they should make the pilgrimage, if you will, to DC?
So our values as an organization within Capital Pride is really to, like I've been saying all this time, is to create space for dialogue. And so for the Human Rights Conference, it's really about these types of conversations and continuing them and then having them on an international scale. And so people should be prepared to be a part of those conversations, to hear dynamic speakers, to engage with somebody that they might not have engaged with from a different part of their own country or someplace around the world. But it is really around human rights and like the multifaceted idea of what human rights are. And we talk about human rights, and I don't think there's like a global definition of what we all sort of think when we talk about human rights. Some of us might be more focused on racial justice. Some might have more focus on accessibility, and all of these things fall into the categories of human rights and how we're supporting each other. We could also talk about the anti-LGBTQ plus bills that exist, that are popping up everywhere now, that, you know, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in some countries in Africa, what's happening in all over the world. And so those are the types of conversations that folks can really, really get excited about. And again, it's an opportunity to convene. As you and I have both been to a World Pride before and a Human Rights Conference before, there's opportunity to really, really engage with a lot of people and to keep those discussions open and going. And that's our hope, is that we begin these discussions in this space and we're able to help, you know, folks take that back to wherever they are and continue those discussions and learn something from their peers and from leaders and from others, and move that needle, you know, really push us forward.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yay.
Thanks again, Natalie.
Thank you so much. This was fun and engaging, and I'm really excited for what you all have in store for the future.
So that means you'll do it again then.
Sure.
We're going to hold you to that.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, we thank Natalie for joining us. I wanted to remind people about the podcast. We're going to have difficult conversations. We're going to have fiery conversations. Some of our guests are not going to hold back. And I want to encourage that, because it's time for us to get comfortable with the uncomfortable if we're hoping to bring about meaningful change. So join us next time on Perspectives Podcast, which is produced by the Black Pride Network. And thank you for joining us.